Okay, so thank you, everybody. I'm Wesley, that guy. I'll literally answer to anything. I don't care. And yes, my bio, when I do these kinds of things, typically makes some kind of robot joke because I don't take anything seriously. So let's talk a little bit about Coldriver and the malware chain that I'm going to be describing here. It comes in multiple different stages that I obviously had to nickname Norobot, Yesrobot, and Mayberobot. And Billy at Google hates me for it. He says they're terrible names. I think he's wrong. And that's on camera, so there we go. All right, so who am I? For those of you who I haven't met before, I am a security engineer at Google. I mostly work in the Russian and Eastern European space, tracking threats in that area. And I promise this actually is relevant. I am a walking internet meme. There has been a meme for many, many, many years now that I may or may not be a robot. The actual meme is I am a robot, but is since morphed into I may or may not be a robot. And it's gotten to the point where people who I don't know who they are at conferences will be like, oh my God, you're the robot. And I'm like, who the hell are you? So I am a walking internet meme, and I actually do promise it is relevant here. For those tracking Coldriver, this might look a little bit familiar, or at least part of it might look a little bit familiar. If you're not familiar at all with Coldriver, it's a Russian threat actor group, typically target like NGOs, diplomats, former diplomats, ambassadors, military intelligence, former military intelligence, that kind of stuff. And they love to target them usually at their personal address or at like their NGO address, work address, whatever that happens to be. So you typically don't find their stuff like in the wild unless you happen to be like sitting at the NGO doing security for them, or like at a big provider where like their Gmail account is, let's say. So typically, when most people think of Coldriver, they think of their phishing cluster. That's the cluster on the left. By and large, the past like year, it's mostly been compromised WordPress redirects that they're sending out. Those WordPress redirects, if they like you and they want to serve you the next stage, they will redirect you usually to a phishing backend. Excuse me. And they do have like this weird cluster of Proton themed domains that have come up over the past like 8 to 10 months, like Proton captcha.org, I think, was one of them. And there's a series of these Proton themed front ends. Those they typically, at least in our visibility, only use when they're targeting people at Proton addresses. So for whatever reason, they think that like makes their lure more interesting. But generally speaking, if you see them, you're almost always going to see them start off with a compromised WordPress redirect that will either redirect to the phishing backend or to the malware cluster, which is where I'm going to spend most of my time talking. The malware cluster almost always starts with something that we call cold copy. It's their click fix CAPTCHA type thing, where they try to get you to like copy and paste something into the run command. It used to be that they would, from the cold copy, they would get you to execute a chain that ended in something we call lost keys. It's a VB script. I'll talk about that very briefly. But they have since migrated into something that we're calling Norobot, which leads to either Yesrobot or Mayberobot. And that's where I'm going to spend the majority of my time. So the story starts in January 2025. It actually goes back earlier, but for our purposes, starts January 2025. They were using cold copy and leading to lost keys. They did that from January till about May 2025, when Google published on this cold copy to lost keys chain. So if you haven't seen cold copy, this is typically what it looks like. It's a fake Cloudflare CAPTCHA. I don't know if anyone can actually read that stuff in the red box. If not, it's basically, here's a PowerShell command to go fetch something over HTTP and run it. That thing that it's fetching it's a chain of things that ends up in lost keys. But this is typically what it looks like if you actually go and look at their old cold copy code. They still do use this little Command R, Control V graphic. Like, I thought they got rid of it, but I saw them using it very recently. So they still do occasionally use this. So this is what it would lead to. We blogged about it in May 2025, so May of this year. It's essentially the PowerShell from cold copy leads eventually to this thing that we call lost keys. It's a multi-stage infection chain ending in a VB script that is lost keys that basically steals files and system information. It was, back then, it was very rarely deployed relative to their standard phishing. We saw it only a handful of times, I would guess. I'd have to go back and look at my notes to get an exact number, but it was not at all common. So then we blogged about it in May 2025, and then literally like 5 days later, they came back with new malware. So in that new malware, they actually updated cold copy, not drastically, but enough. They updated cold copy, and then they came back with this Norobot and Yesrobot stuff. So that was literally 5 days after our blog. So maybe they did it in response. It's hard to tell for sure. My guess is they probably did. So this is what their new version of their CAPTCHA looks like. They got rid of the Command-R, Control-V little images thing, and they basically put up what looks like a normal Cloudflare CAPTCHA. That checkbox still does nothing. You can check it all day long. It's still going to not do anything. It actually just says like error, and that's intentional. And then, so after that, after you make it through this fake CAPTCHA, you typically would see something like this. I've redacted out for silly reasons because we just are releasing these images, but I've redacted out the URLs, but you can go get them online. If not now, very soon. But they basically prompt you to run this run DLL command using an SMB share out to somewhere on the internet, and they have you pull down something called I am not a robot.dll. So given the whole Wes is a robot meme, when I saw that, it was like, yes, this is a perfect chance to like run with the robot meme. So I did, and we called it Norobot. So this DLL that they are trying to get people to run, we called it Norobot. The first version of it that we saw was, I would call insane. It pulled down a full-on Python install and installed that on the machine because, sure, why the hell not? Other things it did, it pulled down a crypto key. I should be clear, it pulled down a PowerShell command that put a crypto key in the registry. It pulled down 2 bits admin commands that it would then run. Those pulled down 2 Python files. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And then lastly, it pulled down more PowerShell. So it pulled down in total 5 things, one of which was like a 40 meg Python install, because what the hell. So those 2 things it pulls down via bits admin, lib crypto data size and lib system health check. That actually should be lib, I think it's lib crypto pi data size.py. I think I have a typo in there. So it pulls down those 2 things. Lib crypto pi data size actually has a hard-coded key in it, and it uses that key combined with the key that it gets from the registry that it has previously stored, and it will mix them in a certain way. I think it like decrypts the one in the registry and then like concatenates them together. I don't know the full details anymore, but it basically uses it to decrypt libsystemhealthcheck.py. That is a full-on, when it's decrypted, it's a full-on Python script. And that is what we are calling Yesrobot. So if you miss the crypto key or you miss the decryptor, so the crypto data size stuff, you'll never be able to recover this chain unless you know those keys. So it's kind of a pain to track because you have to have at least a couple of those steps to figure out what's going on. So this is what Yesrobot looks like. And like that is the majority of it. It's pretty garbage. You can see a hard-coded key in there. That's their AES key. They basically make an HTTPS call. Whatever gets returned, they just AES decrypt it with that key and then just blindly execute it. So like you can shove any Python you want down to this and it will just execute it. And then it just loops again and again and again. So it's a very simple backdoor, but not like super easy to use. Like if anyone has ever actually done this kind of stuff, like I don't want to write the code to like fetch and execute the next stage. It's like 20 lines of Python. No one wants that. So it's super cumbersome to use. But that is what they were using. And this is the stuff we call Yesrobot. It's probably a good time for me to also mention Zscaler put out a blog on some of this stuff. They had a version of the DLL, so that's Norobot, and they had a version of the PowerShell stuff, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this stuff is not in the Zscaler blog at all. So this is a unique contribution here. So that takes us from mid-May. We saw that used literally a couple times, maybe 2 times over 2 weeks, 3 times at most over 2 weeks. It's 2 or 3 times over 2 or 3 weeks. Then they really kind of started to simplify Norobot, and the next version of their backdoor away from Yesrobot started to appear. So starting on the right-hand side, they really simplified Norobot. So they were doing very basic anti-evasion stuff, so like changing the DLL name, changing the export names, changing the C2 paths that were hard-coded in the binary, and like they went from hard-coding them to like building them on the stack now, that kind of stuff. And they changed the path, they changed the file name, they changed the exports, very basic stuff. But in the process, they started to simplify it down, and it got over a couple of revisions, we saw it get to the point where it was just executing a single command that it would fetch from the C2. That single command ended up being a downloader that would pull down Mayberobot for you. So it became much, much easier to track their stuff. At the same time, like I said, we saw 3 times over a couple of weeks, we saw them use Yesrobot, or attempt to use Yesrobot, I should say. And like I said, that's a very complex chain. It's got like 5 files and a Python install and insanity. And the backdoor that ends up being at the end of this is not super great. It's kind of cumbersome to use, kind of annoying. So they very clearly were simplifying and moving to something else. And that something else that we saw them go towards was a tool that we call Mayberobot. So as part of their simplification process, like I said, they were reducing things down to fetching just a single file. That single file was heavily obfuscated, probably custom obfuscation. My signature for it has only fired on their stuff. But it's a heavily obfuscated probably custom PowerShell that ends up pulling down more obfuscated PowerShell, same obfuscation. And when you deobfuscate it, you get a bunch of garbage at the beginning and at the end, but in the middle, there's like this large chunk of like perfectly workable PowerShell. I hope people can read that. It's kind of small, but it's a very, again, it's not a super complicated backdoor, but you can start to see like things that actually look like a normal real protocol would. So they fetch a command. If the command starts with 1:::, which is like up in the top third or so, right below the 4 each. If it starts with 1:::, that means it's a URL to download and execute. If it's 2:::, it's a command that they'll execute with command.exe. And if it's 3:::, it's a PowerShell block that they will just execute directly. So again, like if you want to go and like fetch a file, it's now fetch and execute a file, it's now much easier. But if you want to like walk the file system and steal a bunch of documents, you got to provide the full PowerShell. So it's not, compared to Yesrobot, it's not great, but it's definitely a step towards kind of a more workable backdoor. And we also think Yesrobot was probably done in response to our initial blog on lost keys. They just had to get something out quick. So within 5 days, they had pushed Yesrobot out. And then this gave them time to like actually put some thought, I wouldn't call it a lot, but some thought into a backdoor here. So that's Mayberobot. That takes us through about mid-June. We saw Norobot continue to evolve. So they went from this like fetch 5 things and crypto keys spread up between multiple files to a single file with just custom obfuscation. And now they realize probably that's the wrong way to go. If you want to like make it harder for me to do my job, you should probably like have multiple crypto keys spread all over the place. Make it a little more difficult for people in this room to know what's going on. So they started to evolve back in the other direction and adding a little bit more encryption and multi-stage stuff to their chain. So at this point, Norobot, it did support a single file download. Like I said, it downloaded that logon script. That logon script was Mayberobot, or led to Mayberobot. It was very easy. So then they evolved. So this is June 2025. We saw a new version of Norobot. We have seen multiple versions before then and since then. But this was the first time that they kind of went back to this like multi-stage downloader, so to speak. So they went back to pulling down multiple URLs. Essentially, at its core, they just took the old Python code and ported it over to PowerShell. which meant they didn't need that like 40 meg tarball or what RAR file, whatever it was. So they pull down more PowerShell that will store a crypto key in the registry, just like before. In this case, they have another key, an IV, also stored in the registry, and then they have their downloader. The downloader pulls those keys out of the registry, combines them with the one that's in the file, just like before. So you have to have multiple of these stages to kind of get everything working together. But at the end of the day, you end up with that PowerShell with the the 1:::, 2::: kind of stuff. That is what we are calling Mayberobot. And again, I like the names. I don't care what Billy says. Tom gets the joke. So I'm going a little bit fast here, but at the end of the day, in about July 2025, Norobot kind of stabilized a little bit, and it very much seemed like Mayberobot was their tool of choice. They still do basic anti-evasion, like they're constantly changing their export names and their DLL names. So if you're like hunting on those, it's not great, but it's good enough. So they're making basic changes to Norobot, but at its core, it seems to more or less have stabilized into this like download a couple of stages and execute them kind of thing. And Mayberobot seems to be their tool of choice. We have not seen Yesrobot actually deployed. Thanks. So this is actually the last slide. I'm going way too fast. But at the end of the day, Coldriver is still kind of two main clusters. Most people are aware of their phishing cluster, but we're trying to raise the awareness of their malware cluster because they seem to be getting more aggressive with it. We're not entirely sure why they choose to deploy Norobot versus just phishing people. We still see them doing both. One theory is they will deploy their malware only after they have compromised someone, like compromised their account, I should say. Because at that point, they've already stolen all your emails, all your contacts, so now they want data off your device. So it's at that point that they'll turn around and phish you with Norobot. Don't know whether that's true or not, but that's a theory. But like I said, we still see them doing both malware and phishing, but they are definitely way more aggressive than they have been with malware. It used to be Spica was like their malware from like 2 years ago now, a year ago, whatever it was. Then they went to this stuff, or then they went to Lost Keys, and they were not super aggressive with either of those. They're definitely way more aggressive with this stuff. All their cold copy domains used to share a theme. They were always like document.something or documentsomething.com, something like that. They had like document or viewer. They usually had a theme, and you could tend to spot them. That's not entirely true now. But they tend to, if they are buying domains, they do tend to buy them in a theme, at least for certain targets. They have certain themes domains, just like their Proton one, that they tend to do with certain targets. And what they used to do was they would always buy domains in pairs. They'd have a front end and a back end, and you would only ever see the front end in email, and then they would redirect you to the back end. They've basically stopped doing that now, and they only buy back ends, and they're just using compromised WordPress as redirects now. Except for the Proton themed ones generally. It used to be a heavy use of Proton Mail for attackers in the beginning of this year. It still is, but they definitely are. Excuse me. No worries. Just thought I was in a Nintendo game. It's cool. So yeah, they used to be very aggressive about using Proton Mail. And for some reason, they have started to migrate back to other providers. So it's not entirely heavily Proton anymore, but definitely, like if you see so-and-so at Proton and you know that so-and-so and they're not a normal Proton user, there's a really good chance it's Coldriver. They love to impersonate people. They love to use Proton, Gmail, Outlook, and Yahoo as their main providers nowadays. I have lost track of time, but I know it's way too fast. Thank you.